This week's project is a bit of a challenge. My students picked this picture from the ones that I presented to them, and they thought this would be an interesting one to try and figure out how to do it. I decided that I wanted to try several different ways. So this is the photograph. So anyway, we'll dive right on. My challenge this week is to try and create this feeling of these clouds that come as little waves across through the sky. They've got a combination of hard edges here on the top and softer, sort of billowy, graded ones coming down the other side. I'm not positive how I'm going to do this, so I've actually come up with 3 different experiments. My one that I'm going to work on right now is I've started by doing a little bit of yellow and red on the page to get this feeling of light coming in. This is getting to be evening. The light is starting to take up a little bit of a glow of yellow and pink, and so trying to recreate some of that. I put that down first. Now what I'm going to attempt, we'll see how this works out, is to paint this a little bit at a time, starting with, and I decided to try a combination of Prussian blue and Indanthrone to get my dark up here. And so I'm going to start by painting that, and I'll do a little bit of lift for some of these clouds, but I want to come in hard on the edge of that and slowly work my way down, shifting to another blue. I'm going to use peacock blue as we get down further. It's very similar to phthalo blue, but a little bit more turquoise. So let's start by getting just a little bit of paint on my brush, and then I can make it darker. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to find the edges of these clouds right there. Just do that much of it. I'm afraid that if I do much more than that, I'm going to not be able to control things. So I just want to sort of find these interesting edges of these clouds. And as I come into here, there's an interesting cloud right there. And then this is all sky. So let's just blend that, get it right up to that very edge, take it out into this corner, and take it up onto the edge of that cloud there. This is going to come in underneath of here. Now let's get a little bit more intensity of color up in there. It's a pretty dark sky, and I want to get that feeling of that dark sky. And this is going to be interesting. I'm not sure how well it's going to work. I've tried some other ways of doing this as well. Now I want to come in with some Indanthrone blue in here as well. So I put some of the Prussian blue down first, and now I'm putting Indanthrone into here. Let's roll this around a little bit, get those colors blending. You know, we did some experimenting with pouring, and in this smaller space, I think that just adding this color in and rolling it around is going to work just about as well. Okay. Now I'm going to need to quickly come back in here, soften these lower edges, dry my brush 3/4 of the way, pick up the bottom of this and feed that up into here. Feed that up into there, and then maybe some other lighter spaces out into there. Some little bit lighter spaces are going to join on the edge of this. So let's just let there be some lighter spaces. I'm just lifting it out with my almost dry brush. And don't want any too hard of lines. Everything else is pretty much soft. Now this side of this cloud, let's just take some Indanthrone blue up into here and soften that up into this. Let that be hard up at the top, add a little bit of Prussian to it. Maybe some of that cloud's going to fold through there. And this is interesting doing those 2 colors because the Indanthrone actually gives almost a gray tone to this, but the Prussian gives you the greenish feeling. And now let's soften, soften, soften. And I don't want to lose all my whites. Soften that up. Maybe this is going to come a little more down into here, a little softer. And this guy should not be just a big blob. It's soft on all edges. Yeah, that's starting to look a little better. Let's just, okay. And then maybe some of this comes up a little softer out of that. Sort of fun to do just a little bit at a time, work my way down in through here as we go. Okay, now next layer down, back to my Prussian blue. It comes as a little bit of an angle here, so we're going to find the edges of this, find the edges of that, and just painting to the top of the next set of clouds there. And so then I have to think about what the shape of that is as I come next to that. I'm going to do this fairly quickly so I don't get hard lines in here, and that's why I'm only doing a little bit at a time. And then we'll add just a touch more paint to make this a little darker, and thrown into it just a tiny bit, not very much, because at this point we're going to be shifting down into peacock blue the next round. That Prussian is working pretty nice in here. Okay, so now let's get this softened up into the bottom of those clouds. Dried my brush, rinsed my brush, dried my brush halfway. Come up into the bottom of these clouds. And now remember that color when we put the end thrown, that slightly purpley blue into the bottom of these. That worked really sweet. I liked that combination. And some of these go smaller, some of them go almost across, and maybe work back down into this a little bit. Maybe work all the way across there. And now we're going to get some more. Actually, we're at the point where I want to shift in toward my other blue. Let's let it blend up into here just a wee tiny bit. It's a little bit wetter because I wanted it a little thinner, which may cause some problems. I'm seeing it starting to bleed right there already. And maybe that breaks through. And let's just do a little lift on that. Maybe that's going to lift up into those clouds just a little tiny bit more. Let's break some of these. Now into some more of those. Boy, you have to work pretty quick on this to keep it from being and Indanthrone blue. Let's just make sure I've got Indanthrone blue available for the bottom side of these clouds. I've got to be careful that it's not too dark. That feels too dark, but now I need to take and clean my brush and sort of spread and pull that up into the bottom of those clouds, letting that little bit of dark still hang in that blue at the bottom. This is coming out pretty interesting. Of all my experiments, I'm actually liking this one the best so far. Maybe run that a little bit more. Okay, now this cloud here, let's just put a little bit of this darker in the bottom of it. Darker in the bottom. Oh, this takes a lot of concentration. Can't be thinking about anything else. And just sort of lifting, softening, lifting, softening, lifting, softening. Maybe a little bit of paint on there. So before that gets too dry, I've got to come back in and soften this bottom edge. So the top edge we're leaving hard. This bottom edge I'm softening. And adding just a little bit of Indanthrone blue in here. It's nice that it's sort of blending down into that wet a little bit. Try not to get it too dark as I put it on. Some of those clouds work across that blue. And it's uneven. Some places it's thicker than others. Oh, no, this is going to start getting too dry here pretty quick. Let's just come in and work that one. So just a little bit of Indanthrone blue on my brush as I come in and touch this. Almost dry brushing. Okay, my last little bit here now. Soften these edges. Soften those edges just a touch. Maybe lift out into this area a little bit. Edges just a hair, maybe break that up a little bit. Come back in with a little tiny bit of Indanthrone blue. The Indanthrone blue leans slightly toward the purple side, which is working nicely here. Now, I am feeling down here in the bottom, I might actually need to come in with just a little bit of yellow. Let's try adding just a, no, not yellow, we need, I need a little bit of purple. Okay, that's maybe a little better. But it's a bit too dark, so I'm gonna have to lift it on the edges. It can be dark on the very bottom, but it has to grade up into this white area. And I can come just with a slightly damp brush with just a little bit of paint on it, come in and soften those edges with just a little color. Okay, so let's go ahead and just start working some of this off. I'll come back in with another sponge that's a little cleaner after I've done this first lift. I'm already starting to get some light spots. I like that. Need to rinse this brush every so often, not brush, sponge, my melamine sponge, Mr. Clean Magic Eraser. Clean it off every so often just to get the extra paint off of it, so I'm not just rubbing more paint back into the surface of the page. And so we want these clouds to sort of come in a little diagonal down in through here. Just sort of looking at those patterns and seeing how they're working here. And I'll come back in with my rag and dry this, lift off that paint that I just lifted. And your sponge is going to start disintegrating. That's not anything to worry about. That is just the nature of these sponges. That's what they do. It's part of how they work. It's getting to be a little bit skinnier, so I'm having to sort of squeeze my sponge and just use a little bit less of it. I'm not going to get it exactly as what's there, but we'll get close. And now let's get that rag on there, get that lifted up. does look interesting. Okay. One of the disadvantages of these sponges is control for a small space. I'm just wondering whether I should wrap some on the end of a brush or maybe just have a little small piece of it. Let's try this little small piece of it. See if I can do a better lift across the top of these. And I think at this point I need to just take my little lifting tool out of there. That'll be there so you guys can see the picture. Let's do another little, don't necessarily want it all clean, but we want those highlights to come out a little better. Let me tear off another little piece. This is a damp sponge, it's not dry. I've got it wet and wrung out the extra water. This rag looks like it's dirty, but it's actually been washed several times, and so it's pretty clean. If it's a dirty rag, then I'm just going to be putting paint back in there again. Don't want to do that. I guess the other question becomes, do we like it? And you know what else I want to do is just take and drag underneath here to sort of get that little bit of a softish look on the bottom side of that. Making that a little better. Okay. Now this one needs a whole bunch at the top. Now I could, if I really want some hard edges on this, remember my little using a stencil and rubbing across it, I can get a much harder edge. And let's undo this. I cut some nice little cloud shapes when I was working with this on another project. That's working. That's working. Okay. And let's try this. Try this. Bring this in again, down in here. We want some little bits. And here we want a puffy bit. Let's get another bigger piece off of this. And one more nice big super light space. Don't want this to look too much like I did a computer digital, but we are using the same stencil, so some of those shapes will be repeated. Do we recognize that repeat? Do we want to break that up a little tiny bit more? Do I want to take it? Okay, we'll just do a little lifting off the bottom of this. Maybe this end can get softened a little more. Yeah, that's better. Get that rag on there real quick before all that starts drying in there. And then let's do a little more lift right up in here. Well, this looks better than I thought it was going to. And I want to get a couple more little nice clean lifts off the top edge here. Yeah, that would work. Some more here. Sorry if I'm talking really light. I'm just doing some little lifts along here, playing with my stencil to get these edges. So I've got some nice firm, sharp little edges here. So I'm pulling across the my masking. This is a plastic liner from a notebook, a binder. You can buy them in any office supply, but you want to get the plastic ones, not the paper ones. And what do you guys think? Anything else that I should do? Maybe a little bit more right in here. Just want to break some of those spaces just a little tiny bit. And let's take that up just a little bit because I like this little jig jog that's happening there. So let's jig jog this up. Not pushing very far with this, just a little ways, but utilizing that hard edge that we get from the stencil to give a hard edge down here. I like that better. Yes, that's nice. That added just a little nice touch to it. Okay. Sample number 3, I was playing around with various different methods of masking and then pouring the paint on top of this. So let me just sort of, and I'll show a picture of the masking on here, but I want to sort of point this out a little bit. So these spots right here were all done using masking fluid. These areas right here, I took and I did a dry brush method of putting the masking fluid down so that it was just hitting in some places, and I really like what happened on those edges. This is some more dry brush with that masking fluid, some more dry brush with the masking fluid. This was put down with blue painter's tape. This was put down with white artist tape, white artist tape. Masking fluid once again. Oh, and I did this with using a Frisket paper and then doing some masking around the edges. And it bled through a little bit here in some of those places where the masking and the Frisket joined. This one here was done with Frisket, but I thinned the Frisket down so that it was had quite a bit of water in it off on these sides where you're getting those thinner places, which makes sort of an interesting shift into the clouds. So what you want to know what paint I put on here. This blue was cerulean blue, and I found when I poured it that it was too thick. And I didn't like how it was sort of clumping up. You can sort of see a little clumping right there, and you can see some there and there. So I came in with a spray bottle, and I sprayed a lot of it off. And so it ended up thinning it down and making some lighter spaces in there. This was Indanthrone Blue up here in this top, and I just let it sort of bleed halfway across the page and then turned around and bled it back off. So basically I was doing a bleed from two different directions with a little join in the middle. I did find that this masking really slowed the pour down, and you had to sort of fight a little bit to get it to go in all the corners. I don't know, it might have been easier to have done it with a brush. So my next thing on this is I now have to come in and do some softening and lifting on edges. I can do it with a brush. I can do it with Mr. Clean Magic Eraser. I can do it with my brush. I could do it with a sponge. I'm not positive which is going to be the best. I have a feeling that my sponge is going to be harder to work with. So let's start with a brush, see how that goes. The brush is your softest, least intrusive lifting method. You can't do as much with it, but the Cerulean Blue had a lot of particulate matter in it, which I think is also makes it sort of poor for pouring. So all the pourings that I've done since after this were done with, let me get a fresh rag here. That one is, and that's really not lifting very much. So let's get in here with Mr. Clean Magic Eraser and do a little bit with that. It doesn't matter that it's got a little bit of blue stain on it, as long as I'm just lifting this bottom edge. We've got darker clouds coming in underneath of there, but it doesn't have a hard edge on it, so I don't want that hard edge. So before I come in and darken those clouds, I need to take that hard edge off of there. But I like how that made a real soft little edge on those clouds and didn't leave a lot of hard edge behind. Interesting. And then these guys, and maybe we can clean out into that sky just a wee touch. I'll do the same thing here. So doing this method of masking really does require doing some lifting afterwards so that you don't end up with obnoxious hard lines where you don't want them. Unless you want to do a very graphic design, in which case this would look just great. And is that masking still on there? It is. Hard to see it when it's white. I just want to get the tip of it there. There it comes. It wasn't wanting to do any lifting, and it's like, well, just a minute, why is it not doing any lifting? And it's because I didn't get that off of there. Just sort of holding on to this with the tip of my fingernails to control it a little bit here. So what do we think? Soften those just a touch. Maybe leave some hard bits behind. I don't like this real straight line here, so let's get that. Part of that cloud, I don't mind that. I think I'm going to leave that alone, not worry about it. That little hook right there, I'm not sure I like that. Let's soften that guy up. Sort of square, hard edge there. These things are maybe a little too much there. Okay, that's actually looking better already. Now let's get some of that dark side of those clouds put in. Remember what we did with my other experiment, that Indanthrone Blue, with just a little bit of quinacridone rose in it to make it a little more purple, and then a touch of this brownish red in there, gray it down. I think that's going to work pretty good. So now, let's see here. So what I'm wanting to do is just put on a little bit of dark and then come in and soften the edges of it. So this gave me an opportunity to have spaces to work in, but it still means that I need to play with those spaces and make them work. And then that needs to be softened and soften all the way around this edge of this piece. Still keep it pretty light. Soften that edge. So I'm grading between mid-tone to light until I get to that white space. And we just leave it white. None of those are going to be real white, so we're going to gray that down a little bit and then soften this edge here. And then maybe we want it a little bit lighter back over in this area here. So let's just take Mr. Clean Magic Eraser and so as you can see, a combination of these methods becomes part of what we end up having to do to make it work. But which do we like best as a starting point? How does that make it harder or easier to work with it? I couldn't really tell you which is the best. They've all seem to have some positives. I think part of it becomes which is easier to control, which do we find most suitable to the end result that we want. Yeah, then I can come in and work this next one down here, just doing not too much at once. Because I want to be able to control how I do the softening of the edges, and that takes the most precise timing. If it's too wet, it'll just run right into what I just did. If it's too dry, I'll have a hard edge. So I want to do just a little bit at a time so that I can come in with just a little bit of a damp brush, touch the edge, see how it's moving. If it's moving too fast, I'm going to back away from that and wait and do it later. Now I have a little bit of damage in my paper here. What was that? Was that frisket paper that had been on there? It's left a little damage behind. That's, oh no, that was right at the very edge. So did I damage that with my Mr. Clean Magic Eraser when I was doing that edge? It's possible. And then these clouds, some of them are white, some of them are darker. I really like what happened with that dry brush on that frisket. And just leave a little white behind on these. Soften that edge. Interesting. I'm liking liking this combination of a slightly purpley tone versus the teal that we have in that sky. And that's, you know, when you lift with your brush, you got to really work hard to actually damage the paper. Mr. Clean Magic Eraser doesn't damage the paper super easy, but if you really press on it, it will. And if the paper is slightly damp when you go to do it before you start, it's more likely to damage because your paper is weakest when it's damp. So that's one reason why you dry it completely before you come back in and start doing those lifts. Because if I come back in and lift with Mr. Clean Magic Eraser on a wet area that I've just been painting, all it's going to do is drive that paint right into the paper, because the surface of the paper is going to be wet a ways in, where if it dries, then all the paint has lifted toward the surface, most of the paint, and you're only wetting the very top of the surface, and so you're not driving that paint down into the body of the paper. And you know, as I get down into here further, I'm seeing this as, oops, turning a little bit more peachy. Maybe I should have kept that brown that I had going there into the blue, put more back into there. A little more of a red purple as it comes down into here. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's gone down on there pretty dark, and I need to pick some of that back off. I had a red-brown mixed for another painting, and maybe it's going to come down into these spaces. Don't have too much on my brush, just wanted a little light. So that runs across there. My brush is too dry that I'm just going to have a lot of marks from that. Okay, I'm going to stop and look at these from a distance, see what I think of what I did, and then put it down for a final commentary for you. Bottom line is that there's more than one way to do any project, and how do we want to accomplish how much control do we feel we need, and I'm not liking what does it need? It needs something a little bit different. I'm not liking that little place there very well. Maybe this lifting needs to come a little further away. And maybe a little more lifting underneath here. When it's this dark, it's actually pretty easy to lift with your brush or with Mr. Clean Magic Eraser. They're all going to lift some. Does that help that a little bit? Now we've got too many of those going in the same direction. Let's pull some of it down this way. All three of the paintings up against the wall and looked at them from a distance, and now I'm going to just sort of talk to you a little bit about what I think should be improved on each of them. So when you go to experiment, you can try all three of these techniques that I played with and see which one works the best. Top, and then it just felt like we could use with some more clouds off to the side over there, maybe a little bit here, just to break up this really strong diagonal. It's nice having a diagonal, but when they get so strong that they're taking over the whole painting, then it's time to sort of break it up a little bit, soften it. Okay, I think that works a whole lot better on that. So now let's have a look at the other two. The other two have got their own little problems. So this is the one where we didn't have anything drawn on here, and I painted it coming in and painting around the shapes that I had, starting with a darker color here at the top. There was a mixture of Indanthrone blue and Prussian blue. I think the Indanthrone took over a little bit there. Actually like the color better here, but then when I shifted to my peacock blue, was a little thinner and it made a big water spot right here. So let's just see what we can do about easing that out. I have two choices. One is that I come in with some more dark color in through here, but I think I need to soften this intersection before I do. So let's just soften that a little bit. Take it right down into those edges. I don't want a hard line for where I softened either. Okay, I think that might be sufficient. And now, let's see, which one of these rags am I using? I also feel like maybe those edges are a little bit hard there too. So let's just do a little bit of, if I lose some of that white, I think it's probably better than having those super hard edges there. Okay, so that's going to have to dry a little bit before I can do anything. What else needed to happen here? Remember, we're working with really staining colors, so they're not wanting to lift very easily. And so that's one reason why Mr. Clean Magic Eraser is a helpful friend. We'll break through there just a little tiny bit. It just felt a little bit harsh was all. Okay, is that dried enough? If this is too wet when I come in, that's going to just break right through all of that. But I think we can do this now. So my peacock blue has been drying here a little bit, so now it's a lot thicker in the pan. So let's just see what it looks like here. Now if this is still a little bit damp, it's not going to hurt things too much, in that it won't really run across it if it's just a little bit wet, damp. But if it's really damp, then it's going to run right through there. And I don't want any real straight lines. Let's just sort of break some of these. Maybe actually come in and break it up that way. Okay, so now let's get this taken. I need to spread this right on up into here. Bring it right up onto that cloud. Maybe bring it into that base of that cloud. And then I'll soften the edges of that one. And let's let that run down into this cloud. A little tiny bit more can be painted right over that cloud and down onto there. Ooh, that's sort of nice. And let's keep that color running all the way through here. Bring it up onto this cloud. And then maybe thin it just a little as it comes off into here. We're darkest up here and we're lightest as it goes down, and then these guys are coming in at a diagonal. So I actually need to sort of, get a little bit lighter as it runs down into there. Now, before this dries too much, it's a little warmer this afternoon, so it's drying pretty quick. I need to soften this top edge so I don't end up with a big hard line there. this is too dark right here. Pull that away from that, thin that down a little bit. Okay, I think that's better. Not perfect, but so this whole idea of if you're going to do this grades as you come down here, sort of paying attention to how thick and thin that paint is so that you don't get wet spots running up. And at each level here I can change the value just a little bit. I could actually go a little tiny bit. Now that that's a little darker, this feels like it needs to be a little darker. So we could come in and darken this one too with a little bit more. And this time I'm not going to be as thick with this because I don't need to darken as much. So let's just come through and find this next one. And when I do, I need to really pay attention to how I'm coming up to those hard edges. I can come right over my darks. And maybe I want some of those to sort of soften out. You can let some of those soften out. What I mean by softening out is that some of them are thinner and come out into that color just a little bit. Let's just keep moving through here before it dries. Step away from it. Let's pull the other one up, have a look at it. Here, I'll bring this up a little closer for you guys to see it. Some bits and pieces on there. There was still a little bit of Mr. Clean Magic Eraser floating. Okay. And here is our last one. Now, this one had some very interesting things that happened to it. Putting that resist on, I still very much like what happened with the dry brush part of that resist around these edges. A little too harsh where I used the tape. The edges were a bit too hard and not as uneven as I would have liked. This is interesting in here, although the lifts probably worked as well as the thinning drawing gum, the PBO drawing gum. So what would I do different on this one? Actually, I sort of feeling like I might not do very much at all to this guy. Might just leave him alone. It's different than the photograph, but this is sort of a fun little thing that happened up in here. There's some nice light that's running in through here. I like the variation between the teal and the blue. Really learned on this that I couldn't put a something like cerulean blue that has a fair amount of sediment in it. It has to be put on very thin. So it could be, it might have been better to have used the peacock or the phthalo blue in there for that teal. So I think that's got all three of them. And if I ever want to do a big one, I now have some ideas of how to do it. So I think that's it for today. You guys have fun with it. So I've come in and I've done the clouds using my PBO drawing gum, a liquid frisket. Now I'm going to wet the entire surface. Then we are going to pour these three colors onto it. I've got Prussian blue, phthalo blue, green shade, and Holbein's peacock. So those are all very transparent colors. Yeah, okay, so let's get some water on there and then I'll get the bucket in place. So I need to wet this down. I want to pre-wet this because I'm finding that the colors don't want to run across here as well as I'd like if it's not pre-wetted. Of course, this will thin my colors just a little bit. I suppose if I had an even bigger bucket of paint, maybe they would pour across there easier. Some of the pouring that I've seen people do, they actually do it in a lot of thin layers. Thin layers are going to probably run across here a little easier than a thicker layer. Okay, it's a pretty warm day today. This is probably going to dry fairly quickly, so we need to keep moving here. Let me look at it from the side to be sure I've really wet everything, which I didn't. And make sure it's evenly wet as well because I'm seeing it's wanting to puddle in places. So down here I can really sort of see what the Yeah, it's not wet there, it's not wet there, not wet right there. Okay, I think that's pretty wet. Darkest up here, lightest down there. So let's just dive in and see what we can do. Let's see what kind of a mess I can make out of this. Let's start with my lightest color. You probably can't see that from up there. Let me just move this over a little bit so it's more under the camera so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm pouring on paint. I'm going to stop and not have it go quite that far, although it doesn't really matter if this lighter paint gets down into where the darker is going to go, because I'm going to just take my brush and help it along here a little bit, because it's wanting to just jump. But we do want it to sort of run through here. So that's my lightest color on there. Let's make sure it's covered everything. And I'm doing this with my big brush so that I can do it smoothly, because I want that to come out and be pretty even through there. Now, do we want to actually put that darker color on yet? It's going to be up in here. Pour down some of this. I need to shake it a little bit more. It looks uneven. Definitely making a mess on my desk. Okay, now I need to pour the excess back out of here. Let's go ahead and get my cup back underneath of there. Let's help it a little bit in a few places. All right, now I can roll that around. I may not need that third color any longer. Get that off of there. Okay. So, how are we doing here? Let's get a little excess off of this brush so that I can come in and just move a little bit of this. I'm also feeling like maybe I'm going to need to just add a little bit more in there. And then roll that so that it doesn't end up. Some of it's going to come back off that corner. Take a little off my brush. Just come in with the brush and take a little off that corner. That little spot right there. Careful with the brush. If I leave that square brush on there, it's going to have a square brush mark, which I don't want. Now let's also come back in with my rag and just pick a little bit of this off of up in here. I did leave a few little holes in this masking fluid when I put it on, so that some of the blue would show through in a few spots. So I'm not going to worry about that if some of it's that is there. Let me just see if I like. Yes, I do like this much better than what we did in the previous samples. Okay, so I'm going to turn that off, let it dry, and we'll see where it goes.